York, we have spent the last week in New York participating in the HLPF. From the Director Generals of WTO to IMF to the discussion on Friday that we had on small island countries, the numbers, the statistics are very serious and the need is very great. They need assistance, countries, people, the most vulnerable. They need ideas, they need support. Global unemployment is expected to stand at 205 million people in 2022, a large increase from the level of 187 million in 2019. The result, obviously, is a sharp rise in poverty compared to 2019. An additional 108 million workers worldwide are now categorized as poor or extremely poor. On Friday, after I spoke at the HLPF on the SID session, we noticed that both the chair, the co-chair of the session, the minister from Antigua and Barbuda, and the Secretary General of the Commonwealth both welcomed the fact that the private sector is engaged. There is a recognition that business employers are innovative, are creative, are funders, but most importantly, job creators. But we must find ways outside the normal UN hallways to ensure that the private sector is heard and engaged, and not only just in words, but in action. I am pleased to open this virtual conference, and hopefully we will illustrate to many of you the ways that the private sector is leading and bringing solutions to our many social challenges. We know there is a huge task ahead of us as we try to build forward better. But hopefully after today's sessions, more will be inspired by the many best practices and will mimic some of the great work both public and private sectors are doing and trying to ensure no one is left behind. Now, before we start and I introduce our speakers, I would like you to know that at the bottom of your screen, there is interpretation into English, French, and Spanish. So please do use the interpretation. Also, if we could put up this housekeeping slide, just so you know, when the speakers are not speaking, we kindly ask you to shut off your camera. Speakers, also, if you could please mute your microphone when not speaking. Just so you are aware, the event will be recorded and shared with others, and we welcome the whole audience to pose your questions in the chat box. So I would hand over to Andrea Ostermeyer de Souza, the Executive Director of the New York office of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, to give us some welcoming remarks. And after, we will have the Deputy Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar, Mr. Al-Khalif.
Thank you, Shay, for your introduction. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you in the name of the co-hosts of this HLPF side event, the International Organization of Employers, the Permanent Mission of Germany to the UN, and my own organization, the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. As a German foundation linked to the Christian Democratic Party of Chancellor Angela Merkel, Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung works at the intersection of international politics, development, and public education. Part of our mission is as well to strengthen the rules-based international order. The manifold crises that we are facing today underline that multilateralism in the 21st century has to shed off its mere intergovernmental character. It has to become a multilateralism that strengthens the relationships between state and non-state actors, also in order to further the common good and the 2030 agenda. So for us as Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, it comes very natural to facilitate this dialogue and to serve as a builder of bridges between state and non-state actors. CAS has traditionally been a strong advocate for a concept of social market economy, where government, employer, and employee representatives are partnering to provide systems of social protection, engage in collective bargaining, and advocate vocational training. Hence, CAS and IOE are natural partners in fostering private sector engagement in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. We need private sector engagement in order to further development in the Global South, but we equally need adequate legal frameworks, the right incentives and impulses for private sector engagement at home. And one cannot emphasize enough that the 2030 Agenda is not just a development policy concept. The 2030 Agenda is an instrument that provides us with a framework to develop sustainable, resilient, and more equal societies, and to transform our economies. Therefore, I'm extremely grateful that State Secretary Dr. Ulrich Nussbaum from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy has accepted our invitation and will provide a keynote for our discussion today. The implementation of the 2030 Agenda cannot and should not be the sole responsibility of ministries for development. If we look at some of the SDGs which came under review this year, such as SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 12, advocating responsible consumption and production, or SDG 13 on climate change. If we look at those SDGs, we can immediately see the relevance for national economies and the responsibilities of economic actors. Herr Staatssekretär Nussbaum, ganz herzlichen Dank, dass Sie sich die Zeit für unsere Veranstaltung nehmen. Ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has not only stalled the progress in achieving the SDGs, but has in certain areas aggravated the situation and has thrown us back for decades. And in regions such as Africa, but also Latin America and Asia, the worst is not over yet. Large stimulus packages might have served as band-aids to cushion the severe socioeconomic impact of the pandemic, but they hardly contributed to investments which would foster the SDGs. However, and at the same time, the pandemic has also demonstrated the power of science, innovation, and public-private partnerships, for example, in vaccine development. The pandemic also provides an opportunity to redirect policies and to emphasize renewable energies, the digitalization of economies, sustainable production practices, and changes in consumption patterns. But these policies need to be developed in partnership with business, with the private sector as well as investors. They need to draw on the expertise within academia and civil society and need to be communicated adequately to key stakeholders as well as to citizens. Thus, I hope that our discussion today can make a contribution in this regard and will be able to raise awareness on how much more the private sector can bring to the table as a strategic partner for the SDGs. In this sense, I'm wishing all of you an interesting exchange. I thank you all for your interest, and my special thanks are directed to our panelists and to our co-hosts, the Permanent Mission of Qatar, the Permanent Mission of Germany, and IOE for this fruitful cooperation. Thank you so much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying the State of Qatar is extremely pleased to co-host this event with Germany, the International Organization of Employers, and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung on the crucial role the private sector plays in achieving the 2030 Agenda. I would like to recall that the heads of state and government representing the peoples of the world committed in the declaration of the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations to boost partnerships. They clearly understood that today's challenges require cooperation not only across borders, but also across the whole of society. And the United Nations has to be more inclusive and engage with all relevant stakeholders, including the private sector, to ensure an effective response to common challenges. This commitment captures the spirit of networked and inclusive multilateralism necessary to deal with today's challenges. Undoubtedly, the COVID-19 pandemic has opened new avenues for much-needed cooperation, and more international frameworks for sustainability are gravitating towards a multi-stakeholder approach. We can see that today, international organizations, governments, businesses, and civil society are forming public-private partnerships for mobilizing knowledge, expertise, and resources to bridge global multilateral policy and local action, as well as to deliver global public goods. Moreover, a broad-based and green recovery from the pandemic in 2021 and beyond requires investment in skills and innovation, and in this private sector mobilization is fundamental. It is worth to mention the unprecedented collaboration in scientific research by member states, international institutions, and private sector, resulting in the rapid advances made in the development and production of several COVID-19 vaccines to fight the pandemic. Let me also mention that the public-private collaboration is key to bridge the digital divide. Digital infrastructure is the key utility of the 21st century. It is a crucial tool in shaping a green recovery from COVID-19 and driving the development of countries around the world. SDG implementation will not happen without digital infrastructure. Of course, there has been considerable progress in building this critical infrastructure. However, 3.7 billion people are still not connected to the internet, and many, particularly in vulnerable and marginalized communities, lack even basic connectivity. Public-private partnerships are essential to connect the unconnected and ensure digital products are affordable and accessible to everyone. The State of Qatar has long understood the need to invest in public-private partnerships in promoting knowledge, expertise, employment, growth, and development. Our government programs both at home and abroad emphasize partnerships with the private sector for capacity building and skills development. For instance, in the context of COVID-19, our government worked with private sector to put in place stimulus packages for workers in order to ensure business continuity, including payment of wages, as well as income support and job retention schemes. We believe that recovery policies also need to trigger investment and behavioral changes that will reduce the likelihood of future shocks and increase society's resilience to them when they do occur. Central to this approach is a focus on inclusiveness, and for this to occur, the private sector has to be on board. Another interesting partnership was that of the Qatar government, ILO, private sector, and civil society to liberalize Qatar's labor market, including reform of its labor market regularization, leading to the abolishment of the kafala system. I will stop here, and to conclude, I would re-emphasize the State of Qatar's commitment to boost multi-stakeholder engagement toward achieving the SDGs, Paris Agreement, and to build back better and greener. Thank you very much.
Thank you, both Andrea and also Mr. Al-Khalifa. I should mention before I introduce Dr. Nussbaum that our co-hosts today are the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, our co-sponsors being the Qatar mission, the German mission, and IOE. We'd like to thank all of them for their cooperation and assistance in setting up this virtual conference. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Ulrich Nussbaum, State Secretary of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Since April 2018, he has been the State Secretary and responsible for the Departments of Economic Policy, Industrial Policy, Foreign Trade Policy. He is in charge of policy areas of digitalization and innovation, and he also supports the German Mittelstand, the medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone to Germany's economy. In addition, he serves as the coordinator of the German government for projects abroad, which are of strategic interest to the Federal Republic of Germany. Dr. Nussbaum, we're very pleased to have you this morning, and you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mrs. Gopal, Mrs. Ostheimer de Sosa, Mr. Rashid Al-Khalifa, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very important and interesting event. The excellent cooperation between the International Organization of Employers and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung at the United Nations is important and is of proven effectiveness. The two organizations stand for the inclusion of all players, governments, civil society, the private sector, and academia, in the achieving of the Sustainable Development Goals. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has declared this decade a decade of action in order to give the international community a wake-up call. In order to achieve the 2030 agenda, we need everyone on board, and especially the private sector. Only with innovative enterprises and private investment, we will be able to successfully implement the necessary transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy is pursuing a sustainable approach in all fields for which it is responsible. We are working together with the business sector to accelerate the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. And let me name just a few examples. Environmental, social, and human rights aspects play a key role when the German federal government grants investment guarantees to help German companies to invest in other countries. In 2020, total investments in projects in less developed countries covered by federal investment guarantees amounted to around 1.1 billion euros. In addition, the investments help to create or secure jobs. Access to employment is an essential element to reduce inequality. Ladies and gentlemen, our export credit guarantees, which are better known as Hermes insurance, are another important instrument. They enable exports which cannot be financed on private markets alone. Currently, we are drawing up a so-called climate strategy so that the entire system of Hermes guarantees will take account of the climate impact of the project. And at the same time, export credit guarantees support importers, often in countries with low and medium incomes, and the economies. They provide access to cutting-edge technologies, create jobs, and offer opportunities for economic growth. In addition, they are self-sustaining in the long term, and they do not result in any financial obligations for future generations. Ladies and gentlemen, access to energy is a fundamental precondition for economic and social development. Clean energy is key to environmental protection and climate action. In any markets, renewable energies are already the cheapest source of electricity. This is good news. And thanks to technological progress and falling costs, renewable energies are also becoming increasingly attractive for the private sector and for investors, even without any public funding. In the context of its what we call national hydrogen strategy, Germany is investing 2 billion euros in international cooperation to create hydrogen value chains. We are funding large-scale production facilities in countries in which clean hydrogen can be produced in an efficient and cost-effective manner. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that we cannot take prosperity, social security, and a healthy environment for granted. And in its new, what we call Climate Action Act, Germany has substantially increased its climate targets. To achieve these, we will invest an additional 8 billion euros in climate action in the coming years. In the Act on Due Diligence in Supply Chains, we are also helping to protect human rights, but also specific environmental standards. An important aspect for the Economic Affairs Ministry is that companies covered by the rules are given all the help they need if they do to implement them successfully. We need to attain our ecological, social, and economic sustainability goals And to this end, we need innovation, competitive enterprises, and a reliable environment for industry. This is what we are also promoting in the context of international trade relations and global supply chains. World trade offers great opportunities for economic growth and employment. Germany, therefore, advocating open markets based on clear rules. We support the European Commission's new trade strategy, which includes a focus on the environment. At the same time, trade policy can't be expected to solve all the sustainability issues. We always need partners who share our goals. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainability affects every single one of us. This is important to know. And therefore, I wish you all a successful event, many new insights and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much and good luck and good success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nussbaum. We appreciate your words. I'd now like to turn us to our first panel, the partnership dividend. What are the benefits, best practices, and lessons learned of innovative collaborations and partnerships between public and private? I am now going to introduce the moderator, Brian James William, the head of policy and programming branch at UN Development Coordination Office, someone who we work very closely with. Brian.
Thank you very much, Shay, and good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening to some folks out there, and welcome to this. Very excited to get into this first panel where we'll start to get a little bit more concrete and learn about some of the best practices, get some concrete arguments about, what are the benefits of this kind of cooperation with the private sector and their focus on sustainable development. So really it's going to be an exciting panel. You can see everybody on your screen and their photos and their titles. We're going to go in the following order. We'll start with Mr. Santos, the Secretary General of the IOE, and then pass to Ms. Ojiambo from the Global Compact. Then we'll have a chance to hear about the apprenticeship from Nazarene Mani, and finally, last but not least, we'll get to hear from Mr. Dante Pese on business and human rights issues. So I'm going to ask each panelist to take about 6 minutes. I'm going to ask everybody a question. Participants to today's panel, the chat box is open. We will have just a couple of minutes for questions. So now is your chance. Throw in a question into the chat box and we'll try and get to it. And we'll go back to each of those panelists for just 1 or 2 minutes at the end to get back to questions or maybe to respond to each other. And I might have a question myself. So with that, I don't want to get in the way any further. Please, Mr. Roberto Santos, Secretary General of the IOE, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the point we want to raise is how important is that the private sector collaboration goes beyond specific projects, individual projects, and goes also to the dialogue also with resident coordinators. And the collaboration between UNDECO, and I want to acknowledge also the effort that you have been undertaking, Brian, and IOE comes before the pandemic. But when the UN reform was being discussed at the UN, we already started to try to engage with this new figure of the UN resident coordinator, in which you have a strengthening role, which has to do also with the policy impact of the UN. This kind of dialogue that we have been undertaking for us is not just a tool, is the tool really to make things change. We very much refer to the private sector collaboration as a way also to obtain, more resources, or sometimes also to undertake on the ground some development cooperation project. But I think it was Antonio Guterres who already very much insists on how important is the engagement of the private sector. You want to bring creativeness, innovation, which come often with and through entrepreneurship and also individuals in companies. We have witnessed that during the pandemic in the health area, but also with adequate employment policies. The pandemic has made us realize how critical and essential is this to happen. I mean, this collaboration. If we want to have a recovery, which is full recovery, which is job-rich recovery, we need to go beyond a one-off projects. We need to go to the systemic issues, the deep dives, such as a proper business environment, such as informality, such as sustainability in social protection systems, such as skills gap, and also to tackle with ambition the diversity challenges that we have before us. And in order to do that, we in IOE, the first step that we have taken is to create a better basis for a wider, trustful collaboration with the resident coordinator, to better know each other, to better liaise with each of our employers and business organizations. That would be the way also to change not just the specific issues, but the policies, the legislation, the regulation at the local level. This dialogue is followed by a guidance that we with a playbook, a guide in which you can find, for our employers organizations, but with other stakeholders, a kind of key elements to better understand each other. We need a kind of emphatic approach from the UN family on the need of solid but flexible regulation, workable institutions, efficient institutions, and we on the private sector, we need to do much better in terms of engaging with the SDGs, especially on those SDGs in which we have an incredible role to play, like the one that has to do with education goals, with employment goals, many others. We really have to do much better in this kind of good deal, good understanding, and we have many challenges in front of us. Some of them has to do with the different language, different communications that we are using, sometimes with the different identification of deliverables, sometimes with the different rhythms, but we are able, willing, and committed to move this agenda forward with the help of all of you. That's the main message I wanted to transmit, and I also want to thank the other participants for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Santos, and excellent point about how the UN and the business need to work together. We've been saying this for a long time. We know it's not easy to do. The guide that the IOE and the UN has put together encourages both employers, federations, and resident coordinators to work together better. And as part of development system reform, we're encouraging all of our UN country teams to focus more on integrated policy advice. And so the comments you made about regulation and legislation, how we can work with business to work with and governments to get good regulation is a really important point. Let me turn now to the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, Ms. Sanda Ojiambo. She's very well known, years and years of experience in this area of partnerships and focusing on sustainable development with Safaricom, one of the leading companies, very well known for this. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much. I do have a question to get you started this time, and that is, what role can public and private partnerships play in the recovery from COVID-19? So much of our focus in coming months is going to be how we recover from COVID. What role can public and private partnerships play?
Great, thank you, Brian, and thank you to all of you who are present here today, wherever you may be around the world. Brian, thanks. And I just want to really pick up from what my colleague and dear friend Roberto said around the importance of partnerships in whichever way and shape they take. It has been said, we're at a true inflection point. And, as the case is with challenge, there's always the platform and the opportunity to seize opportunities. And how we do it, because we've seen some remarkable partnerships in the past year, partnerships unusual, between private sector actors themselves, very rapid partnerships between private and public sectors. And I think if we can take that model and look at it above and beyond emergency, but really look at how we apply it to going forward, then we really are in a good place. But, reflecting back to your question, as we all know, 2020 for us was the decade of action for the SDGs. filled with promise and filled with momentum, and then COVID hit. But I think what we have seen over the past year is that really no one stakeholder alone can solve these global problems. And certainly no one stakeholder alone can work towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why they were designed and architectured and provisioned the way that they were. So this is a real inflection and reflection point around the fact that all actors, government, the United Nations, private sector, civil society, must commit to working together in a more coordinated and certainly more integrated way. You know, we've talked a lot about the purpose and the power of multi-stakeholder partnerships, the need for that networked multilateralism. And I think that's really what we need to reflect on moving forward. Partnerships, and specifically private sector partnerships, should not be viewed simply as an attractive mechanism for project finance or for implementation, but really for a tool for achieving equity, inclusivity, sustainability, driving forward, you know, innovation and new development solutions, and really charting this trajectory to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, echoing our Secretary General, you know, Antonio Guterres, she said, for us to recover better from the COVID-19 crisis, we will certainly need a new social contract. And that truly is where I think our opportunity lies. If I reflect a little bit on the work of the UN Global Compact and how we see this, our new strategy really calls for shifts, which for us reflect that desire to partner more strongly and in ways that are more robust than before. For us, we see the ever-increasing role of UN business partnerships as a vehicle to overcome some of the setbacks from the SDGs that have arisen from the pandemic. And I think there's also the need within the UN that we need to continue moving towards more strategic forms of engagement, leveraging business partners' core assets and expertise. And as I said, less emphasis on traditional fundraising and philanthropic models of collaboration. Our strategy, as I mentioned, aims to really tap into the convening power of the UN, strengthening our role at the Global Compact as an interlocutor, also looking at how we can hold companies more accountable to deliver once they are in partnerships, because that is truly really important. We also aim to grow our scope further, particularly in the Global South, and also working more effectively with small and medium enterprises, because they truly do power significant parts of the economy worldwide. And, you know, in this regard, I just want to say that, you know, for us, we always welcome continued government support and government presence as we go along. But I think that what I do want to look at also and just highlight here is the opportunity around an upcoming biennial UN General Assembly resolution that is actually focused on global partnerships. The negotiations begin in September. And this resolution really affirms the importance of a principle-based approach to enhance cooperation between the UN and partners, including the private sector. And I think that this resolution and this move towards more robust partnerships will certainly set us in better stead going forward. So, you know, as has been said, I think this is really the opportunity to increase the scale, the speed, the efficiency of partnerships. We need to focus on delivering urgently the public goods that are much needed. And we at the Global Compact just truly look forward to working with all of you to make this endeavor a reality and to demonstrate really the utility of public-private partnerships. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you so much, Sanda, and I understand you've got other pressing engagements in this busy week with the high-level political forum. So if you can stick around for some of the questions, great. And if not, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'd like to turn now to Nazarene Mani, Executive Director of the Global Apprenticeship Network. In some of the work that I've been involved in over the last 5 years out in the field, there was a big emphasis on trying to find ways to make sure that the skills that young people in particular had were relevant to the markets where we know most job growth actually occurs. This is an easy thing to say and a very hard thing to do. And Nazarene, in your organization, this is something that you've been wrestling with. So we really look forward to hearing from you. I do have a question to get you started. You know, you do lead the Global Apprenticeship Network. It is also focused on public and private partnership, as we've been learning about already. What are the lessons that you have for getting diverse stakeholders, so different kinds of organizations with different cultures? How do you get them on board for a common cause? And again, a COVID-19 recovery question. How do you see the work that you need to do to contribute to the COVID-19 recovery?
Thanks, Brian. And I think I must give a shout out to Shay, who's the founder of the GAN. And I think, when GAN started, we were sitting in a similar situation just post the global financial crisis. Youth unemployment was an issue globally. We were dealing with this mass fallout in the labor market. And, 10 years later, here we are sitting again, having to grapple with very similar issues. And I think, when the intention of the GAN started, it really was around co-creating solutions, collaboration for real systemic impact within the labor market, within this nature of work, the changing world of work. I think the impending challenge of the future of work was something we spent the last 3 years talking about, and suddenly everything was accelerated in the last 18 months. And in some ways, it's worked to our benefit. I think there's a real appreciation of the need for this agile and diverse workforce, the need to equip people with skills to respond to very rapidly changing labor markets, the need to be vibrant in our skills that we offer, in the skills that we as individuals learn and develop. So I think it's really good to see conversations around lifelong learning, around the issue of upskilling and reskilling. So for the GAN, that's been critical for us. It's been a central theme when reaching out to the private sector, to our international agencies such as the IOE, the ILO, the OECD, UNESCO, and other partners, because again, it cannot be one organization that will drive this change. It has to be a multi-stakeholder, multi-party driven and multi-country driven approach, really, because I think that's the other thing. There is no one-size-fits-all situation. Every country has different skill needs. Every country has very different labor market demands. So how do we equip the citizens of those countries to respond effectively and efficiently? I think what has been also critically important for the GAN in our work has been ensuring that the private sector has been involved in policy influence, in policy change. So it's not just engagement with stakeholders in the private sector, but proper consultation to ensure that curricula that are being developed, the nature of the education system, particularly the post-school system, so the vocational sector, the university sector, is one that has a real appreciation for what is happening in the labor market. And until you bring private sector into that discussion, the conversation is quite academic. And I think as the GAN, we've really worked hard at both the country level across our networks, as well as with our global partners, to make sure that there is this deep consultation, that the conversation is beyond corporate social investment. It's about meaningfully impacting curriculum design, shaping and upskilling educators, trainers, really seeing the private sector as an invested partner in the system, not just as a recipient of future labor pipelines. So, what we've seen as the GAN through our members has been very exciting over the last 18 months. So as much as, these are multinationals, we appreciate they have the resources and the expertise to rapidly adapt. We've seen Microsoft, for example, put out the Global Skilling Initiative, training 40 million people on jobs in technology that are in demand for free. And I think that's the meaningful impact we're talking about. Nestle has been shaping the Global Alliance for Youth, so driving youth employment strategies, working with private sector partners. But Nestle in the countries where they operate doesn't just look at education. I know as a South African that Nestle in their factories in South Africa even works with the water supply systems in municipalities where they're under pressure. That's that partnership we're talking about, public-private partnerships that go beyond just words. I think in terms of responding to the future of work, we've really seen companies like the Adecco Group, L'Oreal, Accenture, identify different strategies to get people into the workforce. Accenture doing great work around veteran training in the US, L'Oreal looking at the digitalization and technology aspects of their industry and getting young women and girls into the sector. We've seen Zurich Insurance, for example, doing a lot of work around reskilling and upskilling their workforce to address the influence of technology in their sector. And I think that's exciting because they're not just, burying their head in the sand. They're acknowledging the impending changes, but are equipping the workforce. And this issue of diversity, of shaping the workforce and driving innovation have been central themes to our work, particularly in the last 18 months. And I think if we look beyond COVID and we're talking about build back better, I think skills beyond COVID is the burning issue. We're seeing countries, the US, the UK, who are on the cusp of recovery. The first challenge employers are facing at the moment is the lack of skills. They're just not enough people to bring back into the workplace. So how do we create an efficient and skilled pipeline of individuals? How do we build a job-rich recovery? And that is particularly dependent on this agility of the workforce. And I think what is also interesting is this need to ensure that skills transfers can happen, that our education systems build in flexibility, that they build in responsiveness to rapid labor market changes, that they build in the adaptability issue. Along with that is the EQ element. You know, everyone that we speak to, irrespective of the sector, speaks about the issue of soft or transversal skills. It's those attitudinal skills. And I think that is fundamental to school curricula. So if we go even one step back in the pipeline, you know, how are we equipping schools and school curricula to ensure that we equip future pipelines coming in? And I think the opportunities that reskilling and upskilling offer means that there can be sustainable skill strategies. Sustainability in terms of the ability of people to respond to shifts in the labor market, but also to respond to the sustainability agenda. So as difficult as the COVID impact has been, I think on the skill side, there are exciting opportunities, but it does depend on the partnership approach. It does depend on this intensive collaboration and deep and meaningful collaboration. So thank you, Brian, and back to you at the panel.
Thank you so much. I mean, so again, some reinforcing messages here that it's, you know, it's not about business contributing to projects. We're well beyond that. It's about how business can engage and be a partner with other sectors. And you've brought in a new one here, which is the academic and education sector. And, you know, how can the UN, of course, because we work with that sector, how can we work with businesses and governments to think about, you know, how does schooling need to shift? And, you know, one of your last points really resonates from some of my previous work around, you know, schooling's not about the rote memorization and downloading information anymore. It's about how do you work in a team? How do you work in this modern economy that globally we're a part of? So important upstream. I'm going to turn now to our fourth speaker. And just before I do, to remind all the participants here that there's still time to throw a question in the chat box. Dante, you come and have experience with one of the sensitive points, if I can say that, around some of this private sector engagement, which is around rights issues. You spent 6 years working on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So really looking forward to hearing from you about how that particular multi-sector partnership that has to deal with some of these more sensitive issues in some cases, how you can get that partnership working so that both businesses are able to function more effectively, sustainably, profitably, and how workers also can be enjoying their rights. So look forward to hearing from you, Dante.
Sure. Thank you, Brian, and all the other speakers. Actually, we have been running into each other very often lately. So when it's 5 minutes, can you raise your hand? And then you will give me like a signal so I can wrap up. First of all, thank you very much to the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and the International Organization of Employers. My university and my center actually works with both of them quite actively, and also with Global Compact, to whom we are part of for about 15 years as a university. So we are all pretty much interconnected in this call, I have to say. One thing, after 10 years of the adoption or the endorsement of the guiding principles on business and human rights by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, we had the opportunity to assess the first 10 years of implementation with the aim to raise the ambition towards the next 10 years of implementation on the ground with effectiveness. So we have issued a report quite recently, 2 weeks ago, and I have a lot of findings that I can share with you that are sensitive and connected to the conversation that we're having. Thanks to all, actually, the members, the speakers in this call, because they were all very much engaged in the process of evaluating the first 10 years, contributing, organizing consultations, etc. More than 200 written contributions, including from Global Compact and IOE, makes part of this global assessment and findings. Our aim is to co-create solutions that was mentioned before, based on inclusive multilateralism. So bring all stakeholders on board, looking for the solutions. That was the call of the General Secretary, and we follow that. One important finding regarding the SDGs: we are in silos, very much disconnected. At the high-level political forum, almost no conversation about action plans on business and human rights, implementation, development, almost no connection in the narrative. Same thing happens the other way around. When we have the annual forum on business and human rights, almost no reference to the SDGs. And if there's a reference, it's just in the narrative a little bit. But then when you go into, let's say, practical things, when you say, how are they connected? Show me joint indicators, integrated indicators. We actually don't have. So that was an important finding and we have done that before in our working group, that Goal 17 creates and opens a golden opportunity for a new alliance for sustainable development, in which business is welcome to be part of the solution of societal challenges. It's not only part of the problem, it's meant to be part of the solution. That is really good. But we also realized that governments create the enabling environment or not. And for the most part in the world, they have not created the enabling environment for respect for human rights or advancing the SDG agenda and creating the conditions for business to be part of that solution. That is one finding. We, of course, have a number of positive examples, very positive examples, but are a number of examples. It's not the mainstream. It's not the normal narrative, and it's not the normal practice. And practice-based that can be linked to evidence. Where is the evidence that the positive narrative is actually being translated into something practical with continuous improvement behind it, accountability behind it, etc. So it's weak still. The other thing is that governments are not leading by example, setting the bar on their own practices as business owners or as business lenders, let's say development banks or state-owned enterprises or public procurement in relation to SMEs. So when the government bar is low, you don't have, let's say, an authoritative position to actually incentivize or regulate the private sector, because you're making a call to do more than what you're willing to do yourself. So we have elaborated quite a bit on that, on the need for governments to lead by example and to stress policy coherence. Again, another area where we have significant difficulties to connect dots. So when we discussed, it was not the case today with the Minister of Economy of Germany, quite the opposite, mentioning their act on business and human rights due diligence. But the vast majority of the ministers of economy or money ministers don't touch the social aspects of societal challenges. And when you talk about societal challenges with ministers of social affairs, they don't get into trade, commerce, competitiveness, SMEs, productivity, etc. So we have there are even cultural silos that makes life very difficult for normal business and for us to actually, let's say, engage in constructive solution seeking, because it's like different worlds that we're talking to. You knock one door, you turn around, and it's like another planet. And that makes life a bit miserable for the ones that really want to address solutions. We have elaborated also on the SDGs connection to business and human rights. Paragraph 67 of the SDGs on the means of implementation largely ignore, make a call for business, private sector, to use the standards like the guiding principles to guide their connection to the SDGs. Largely ignored. We find some evidence of connection. Let's say Nestle does a good job, and few others, Unilever does a good job, but are the same brands actually that were mentioned before. But if you push me a little bit to go beyond, let's say, few brands, we don't have a lot more that are making that clear-cutting connection between agendas, etc. So that's, let's say, one point that I want to mention, and I wrap up in one minute, Brian. Another finding is that most part of civil society, unions, and indigenous people consider that if big business is left alone, with no strong regulation, with no, let's say, strong rule of law context, will have a tendency, the majority of them, not all of them, to abuse, capture the state, take advantage, don't pay taxes, etc. So there's a negative perception in general that has to be confronted with evidence. But the evidence in many, many places is weak. But I want to finish with a positive note. The positive note is that coalitions do exist. Bangladesh Accord, the Dutch covenants on sustainability. Some have been mentioned before, the agreements with unions in sectors led by the same brands that have been mentioned before on the agriculture sector and the retail industry and the consumers goods context. So there are examples that coalitions, when there is enough political will, when there is enough leadership, actually can work for solutions on the ground. And I will say that's the vision for the future, solutions on the ground, raising our ambition, learning from what works, but not wishful thinking, but actually from the real examples that work, but not avoid the difficult conversations and learn from that is not working. And that put it on the table to not avoid the difficult conversations, sometimes embarrassing conversations of things that should work one way, that are not really working that way. But certainly we have a decade ahead of us where we can make significant change. Thank you, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much. You know, a little bit of a wake-up call that this work is not always so easy. And, you know, I was struck by your comment that governments themselves should set the bar high, should set the example for, you know, good procurement practices, for example, that respect rights, whether it's environmental or workers' rights. And I think that's a good role for the UN. We work very closely with governments. We can be thinking about how to prioritize or identify some examples.
Brian, in our report, we mentioned explicitly the UN that has not embraced the guiding principles on business and human rights. And one example is precisely procurement from the UN itself.
Okay, good. Sanda, you hung in there and you just turned your camera off. I'm hoping you can stay for 3 or 4 more minutes. This is what I propose because we don't have so much time left. In total, I've got 3 questions. My thought was to ask each panelist to think through 1 more minute of examples, and you can answer any one of the questions that you like, but I'll give you sort of 3 choices. Sanda, I think had to just drop off, so sorry about that. So here are some questions. In the chat box, there was one about the role of government, and that in developing economies in particular, governments play an outsized role in the economy, and they should maybe change the nature of their engagement in developing economies. So that's one question about the role of government. A second is somebody asked, you know, what are the ingredients for a really successful partnership? And here, what I might ask a panelist is, you know, if you could just speak of one example of a partnership that you were part of, you know, sort of give one really, really personal example of a partnership and how did you make it work? If you have a good one, then that's a second question. Or the third question, this is my question, is I'm curious about the informal sector. So in so much of the developing world, so much of business activity, of economic activity is in the informal sector. And, you know, how do we reach out to the informal sector in a way where we can achieve all of the things that we have been talking about? So 3 options there. And I think I would just go back to all our panelists in the original order and give you a minute or maximum two to give your final shot. So with that, if that's okay, Roberto, I pass back to you.
Well, you raised several questions and I have 1 or 2 minutes and I will do it very schematically. You refer to the role of governments. It's very often, and I have to be very frank with you, it's very often, and I can give you the example of the Ethical Recruitment Initiative in which the business sector, the business private sector launched an initiative just to join efforts from government, but we see a rhythm from the government side for the institutions, which is slow or even non-existent, and that's very frustrating. And that's also based on is our also main claim in the UN guiding principles, and Dante knows very well, if the public sector does not go at the same rhythm, with the same push, we will never get there. We will never get there. So we cannot insist more on that. I don't know how to put pressure on this. The second question is, what are the ingredients? Trust, trust, and trust. It's very often the case that this trust does not exist. And Dante referred to the trust with the NGO, civil society, and the perception that if the big companies are left at them, I think that has to do with perceptions and trust. In order to have an efficient partnership, you need to invest much time, resources to build trust. The third question, it was related to informality and the informal sector. I just have to say that we have done something wrong in the informal sector. We also keep saying that. It's clear. I mean, we cannot live with the situation in which you have 60% of the occupied population worldwide in the informal sector. Nothing will work if this keeps growing or if this keeps at the same level. And also, if you see in some countries, this goes beyond the 60, goes to 70, 80, 90. So this is a sign of a failure. We need to do things differently, of course, with ambition, but differently. We have some guidance provided in a tripartite manner. And then you ask for a concrete example. We, as IOE, we are normally playing with different partners. We are very much attached to the social dialogue and to the work also of the ILO. But if I give you an example, we have the representative of the government of Qatar also intervening on the first. I think that what we have managed together in an efficient partnership in Qatar is an example of how things can work differently. And I stop here.
Great, thank you so much. Talking about setting the bar high, I was thinking that everybody would choose one question, but you've done all three in a very short time. So now the bar is high for your colleagues. Nazarene, over to you.
Thanks, Brian. I'm just looking at Professor Mtunzi Mdwaba's comments in the chat as well, referring to the trust deficit. And I think, one of the challenges, that question around fear and the prejudices and the ingredients for successful partnership go hand in hand, because we have to move beyond this what's in it for me attitude. It's really about what is in it for the greater good. How can we achieve this impactful solutions that we know we can do together? And again, trust is central to that. But I think what has been key for the GAN particularly is working with a small group of trusted partners, very carefully choosing the countries that we partner with, because we know that, unless we have everyone on board and have all of these key partners on board and aligned to the same outcome, we're not going to get there anytime soon. So I think that's been a good example of working very tactfully around a handful of subject matters, knowing who we can tap into, working with those partners. I think on the informal sectors, GAN, we've seen, the idea of apprenticeships are a complete misnomer in some countries because the education systems just don't support it because of the high levels of informality. So now what we've done is shifted the outlook, and we work with those informal partners like in Kenya, because there's such rich history and knowledge. So how do we tap into the experience, the understanding, and the expertise that sits in the informal sector to be able to lend and add value to our work? I know it doesn't work the same in all the sectors, but we've seen it as GAN. And I think, in terms of an example, this digital skilling project that we're doing with Microsoft has been really valuable because we've brought in a partner. As much as they're a global multinational, there isn't a bottom line issue here. They genuinely working with the countries. They're looking to upskill unemployed people. We've got governments on board. We've got country partners. But actually what's underpinned the work is research. So building the knowledge base, identifying the gaps, and then building this partnership to try and address the issues we've picked up. So I think, it really is a systematic approach. It's a systemic issue, but it's also the human relation issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And definitely, how the Microsoft partnership is a powerful one, and how we recognize that in the informal sector, there's a lot of learning there. So, it's not about kind of getting them from informal to formal, but it's about learning from what experiences they have. Dante, the last minute is yours.
I would like to agree on the second question on trust and how you build trust. And for trust building, you need leadership that does not avoid difficult conversations. Because if you only, let's say, surface around good things and good news, when we know that there is a legacy of bad things and a reality of a lot of suffering for a lot of people, it looks like a disconnected discourse from a fancy office somewhere, disconnected from reality. So issues that hurt, taxation, corruption, corporate capture of the state, business models themselves that are not sustainable, human rights defenders, rule of law overall, and access to remedy, which we have stated that is the reality check, which is when things go wrong for people because failures of the state or failures of business, what happens with real people and the journey they have to follow. And that's a reality check if we're making progress or not, how much we are avoiding, let's say, harm to happen. And when harms happen, what is the practical experience of people? And that's the reality check for business and for governments, I'll have to say. So trust based on leadership.
Great. Thank you so much. My father was a labor leader, and he would certainly agree with you that to build trust, you need to get at the difficult conversations. Shay, we've eaten a few minutes into the following panel. I apologize for that, entirely my fault, but it was because we had such interesting speakers. Thank you so much for those great lessons. And Shay, back to you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and to the panelists. That was such a rich discussion, great examples from skills to business and human rights. But as you said, there are huge challenges, many of our panelists were saying. And so that's great to now move on to our second panel, where we go from dialogue to action. How to translate multi-stakeholder engagement into systemic private sector inclusion in sustainable development programming for powerful partnerships for and towards the SDGs and also to the COVID recovery. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Matthias Thorns, the Deputy Secretary General of the IOE, and he is going to lead this panel. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shay. And this is a very long title for the second panel, but basically what this is about is how to walk the talk, how to make it happen that we have more and better partnerships with bigger impact. And I have a great panel here with us today. We have Damien Mama, who is the UN Resident Coordinator in Togo. We have Renato Hornung-Draus, who is the IOE Vice President and Managing Director at the BDA, the German Employers Federation. We have Lauren Frey, who is the Executive Vice President and CEO for the Americas for Nestle. And we have Kate Access, who is from Plan International. So welcome to this panel and thank you so much for engaging. Because we run already into our time, I directly start with you, Damien. You work in Togo. How is your engagement there with the business community? How is your engagement there with the Employers Federation, the CNP? Can you share any kind of lessons learned there? What works, what doesn't work? Over to you, Damien.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. You know, in Togo, in 2018, when the government developed its national development plan, it was expecting 65% of its funding to come from the private sector. And about a year and a half down the line in the implementation of the plan, COVID-19 hit the country, the world. And the impact that COVID-19 has had on companies across the globe is actually at a larger scale in a small country like Togo, where at least about a quarter of all the companies have reported that they have suspended the activities of their employees. Half of the employees during the COVID-19 pandemic. And you know, the private sector provides almost 3/4 of the jobs here in Togo. So you see the importance of private companies in the development process. So as we talk about recovering from COVID-19 and also the decade of action, I think the conversation we are having today, I welcome it very much because, of course, it's a key component of how do we make sure that the private sector, which is an important actor, actually provides the fullest of the capacity and the competitive advantage that it actually can bring at the table. In Togo, I wanted to share a few examples on some of the issues that the previous panelists also touched upon. One of them is how we keep the bridge between the private sector, the United Nations system, and the government, because engaging with the private sector and getting to know each other in a way that we know exactly what the role of each entity can have is extremely important. Here, we were faced with some of the institutional architecture challenges where you have the Conseil National du Patronat, which is the employer organization, and you also have the Chamber of Commerce, and the structure sometimes can be very blurring. And you really have to make sure that we identify what are the key institutions that can make a difference. This is what we have done. We've done the exercise here, and we realized that working with the employer organization is actually much more effective than the Chamber of Commerce, which is much more public institutions under the government, under the Ministry of Commerce. So while engaging with the employer organization, we actually realized that we were not speaking the same language. Of course, we often say we want a private sector contribution, but at the same time, we don't always understand what the expectations are and what they need to be able to provide the kind of contributions that we expect from them. So we engage with that conversation, and within the framework of that engagement, we were able to invite them regularly now to our UN country team retreats to have those conversations. We now consult them during the ongoing common country analysis, which means that they will be fully involved in the elaboration of the UN strategic plan, which is the UN development cooperation framework. So at the very policy and strategic level, that engagement is happening. And we are happy that we are doing this because those conversations are what really open up the opportunities for effective private sector engagement in funding or supporting investing in the SDGs. Secondly, in a country like this, I think one of the previous panelists actually talked about the issue about regulatory framework and the environment that is created for businesses and private sector companies to flourish. The United Nations here has some policy space and influencing space, which means that we can help the private sector to work with the government and make the business environment much more favorable for investment. One of the examples that we have here is that UNDP and the United Nations Trade Agency, UNCTAD, have recently started working with the government to create a portal for investment, which means that creating a transparency and readability of the procedures that that private sector company needs to be able to meet the requirement of the business environment. It can look a bit small, but that's a major thing, because as much as we expect a lot from private sector companies, it's not always easy for them to comply with the regulatory framework, particularly if this framework is not conducive for development of their businesses. So we are doing that. The other thing that we are doing, which I think is also very important, is on supporting small businesses, directly supporting small businesses, because we talk about private sector. One very important aspect in developing countries is also to give a hand to those who are small but have the potential to create transformative initiatives if they are helped. Of course, in terms of skills training, in terms of small funding, in terms of also getting the government to invest into those small and medium-term enterprises. And they've been doing this with the government as well. Access to digital technologies, innovation, and all sorts of mechanisms that can actually help them to be better equipped and contribute to the development process. Finally, I wanted to touch upon one thing that Nazarene, I think the previous panelists talked about earlier, which is about skills. Of course, we have companies who are willing to invest, including their foreign companies, but they are confronted with the issues of skills available, qualified skills available. Here in Togo, we've been working with the Prime Minister's Office with UNDP funding in a very innovative program called Leadership Development for Graduates. is basically enrolling a couple of hundreds of graduates who are coming from university, who have actually acquired a lot of theoretical knowledge without actually knowing how that can be implemented and translated into the work environment. And that consists in basically providing them with critical thinking, innovation leadership, and putting them in contact with successful business leaders and thought leaders around the globe, basically because this program is supported by a French NGO or company that we are working with called Share. And we have realized that when the young people go through that program, they actually fit for purpose, both for the private sector as well as for the public sector with the government entities, and also some international organizations who are able to employ them. So what I wanted to say to conclude on this is that I see a value of keeping the conversation open with the employer organizations, because the understanding that we usually have while engaging with them is very dynamic, and this needs to be extremely well constructed so that whatever action we take or whatever action we expect from them can actually be mutually reinforcing for the collective impact on the SDGs at country level. Over to you.
Thank you so much for these very concrete examples, and also for making the case for continuous engagement between the UN, between you and the Employers Federation. It's not a once-off, but it's a continuous engagement. Renate, you represent many, many small and medium-sized companies, and Damien spoke about it. How do you engage with them on a difficult topic like Agenda 2030, which seems sometimes miles away from their business reality? Over to you, Renate.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And let me start by saying that I'm really very, very pleased about this event. As Matthias said, I'm the Vice President of the ILO, but I'm also Managing Director at the German Employers Confederation for Economic and International Affairs. So I'm very pleased to see that this event has been organized with the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. I would like to greet Andrea Ostheimer, and I'm very pleased to see that State Secretary Nussbaum was there, and the permanent missions of Germany and also of Qatar are co-hosting this event. So that's really great. Thank you so much for this initiative. As employer federations, Matthias, you already highlighted this, we have a very, very important role to play in raising awareness, building capacity, and coordinating and organizing collective action. Because in particular for smaller and medium-sized companies, the main aim must be for us as federations to offer them information on possibilities for engagements which are directly relevant for them. Keeping them busy with general debates and statements is not really appreciated. They don't really have the time, nor do they have the interest for that. And it will not help promote the sustainable development goals among the business community. And since we talked about SMEs and informality, I think it is very important to really address these forces in the business community, which are so vital and which constitute the vast majority actually of employers. My fear is that too often Agenda 2030, as we discuss it in Geneva or in New York in the international organizations, is turning into a high level and very abstract talking shop, thousands of miles apart from the realities of the ground of companies and businesses. And that's why I would like to just give you some examples of how employer federations, especially now I'm talking about my German employer federation, can contribute actually to making this bridge and this translation from abstract principles to concrete action. I give you one example, which is the initiative, in German it's called Schule Wirtschaft, which we as BDA, as German Employers Organization, organize, which consists of getting cooperation going between schools, the general education schools, and companies in almost 400 networks around Germany and in working groups nationwide in Germany. The main topics are career and study orientation, economic education, and promotion of STEM skills. The portfolio includes company explorations, internships for students at school, so they would go and spend 4 weeks at the age 12 or 13 in a company to get a first flavor of what it means to be working in a company, to do cooperation and training, information materials for schools, companies and parents. And of course, we also organize simulation games and competitions for students to motivate them to get engaged with the world of employees, employers, and of companies. Secondly, for many years, the BDA, the German employers, and of course its member association, because we are a very tightly structured organization, have been committed to promoting the inclusion of people with disabilities. And this is an initiative which aims to break down the prejudice that still exists ever too often, that disabled people are underperforming. And so we try to encourage companies to provide more training, employment, and continued employment for people with disabilities. The initiative offers extensive information, in particular for employers, and here for the small and medium-sized employers, and also possibilities to coordinate cooperation between small companies and large companies. And thirdly, the National Pact for Training and Skills Development in Germany, which we call in short Training Pact, which is an agreement between the federal government and the main central association of the German business community. The main goal of this pact is to create new places for vocational education and apprenticeships. And so we want to have every young person to be given, to be offered an opportunity for an apprenticeship in order to secure the next generation of skilled workers. And this shows how important the work of the Global Apprenticeship Network, which Nazarene has been talking about, is also for all different countries. Dante, in the previous panel, stressed that the UN principles on business and human rights are a powerful and very, very crucial companion to the Sustainable Development Goals. Meeting the corporate responsibility to respect human rights is a key contribution and vehicle through which business can help achieve the broader vision of peaceful and inclusive societies as they are embraced by the Sustainable Development Goals. We have been very much engaged both at the level of BDA, but also at IOE, and here I would like to pay tribute to Matthias's work in this regard, in promoting the uptake of the UN guiding principles among the business community and supporting them in the implementation. But I couldn't agree more with what Damien has said. Implementation must be realistic, and it must not overstretch the possibilities for companies, for small and medium-sized companies in particular, and in particular, it shouldn't create legal risks, which then have adverse effects. So I couldn't agree more with Damien, what you said regarding Togo, but it applies to all countries, and especially to the regulators should really be careful not to overstretch possibilities of the small and medium-sized companies and to discourage them from actually investing abroad and developing their supply chains. However, only with concrete and realistic initiatives we will be able to improve the uptake of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, Sanda Ojambo mentioned the new social contract, which seems to be now the favorite baby of UN Secretary General Guterres. I'm a bit cautious because, you know, this is a very vague term. It means different things to everybody who uses it. So what we need to make sure is actually that it delivers and that we get concrete progress, and whether that is called social contract or not, whatever, I prefer to call it the social dimension of globalization. That's what counts, not flowery terms. And I would like to say in this context that employer federations, and this is really very important, are not only there to mobilize the businesses and their contribution to the Agenda 2030, but they also have a role in being a voice of the business community in negotiations and implementation and follow-up mechanism to the 2030 development agenda, both at the level of the United Nations and at national levels. And here, I'm afraid, we see huge room for improvement. Less than 2 weeks ago, the IOE launched the G20 Monitoring Report, which highlighted that governments are not properly engaging social partners in the follow-up of their G20 commitments at the national level. And these commitments are actually directly linked to the SDGs. So we need more serious commitment to involving social partners and the employer organizations in the implementation of these global commitments. Otherwise, the bridge to real life will not be built. We are really crucial for building this bridge. The desired impact of the Agenda 2030 will only be possible if employer organizations are included. Finally, let me just make one point. We need to find a more inclusive approaches in which sectors, entire sectors that are excluded from collaborative action today at the global level because of their products or services are included again. Every company has the potential to contribute to Agenda 2030. As long as the company is legal, the product is legal, and the sector is legal, all should be done to promote its sustainability journey. Thank you very much, Matthias, and back to you.
Thank you, Renate, for this really differentiation. On the one hand, how to mobilize small and medium-sized companies and how to engage with government, with UN residence coordinator on the political level. Laurent, Nestle, everyone knows Nestle around the world. Whether you're in Tokyo or in San Francisco, Nestle is a global company with a global footprint. What does it mean for you to ensure that across your operations in all the 5 continents, you promote the Agenda 2030? How to bring them on board? And how do you deal with the fact that you have operations in very different national contexts? Over to you, Laurent.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And it's obviously very, very relevant questions for a company our size. We are the largest consumer goods company in the world. And we are probably the most global at the same time. We operate in more than 180 countries directly. We got factories in more than 80. So we got really feet on the ground everywhere. And if you look at our supply chain, it is truly global. And actually, we could put it at test. So it's been put at test by the COVID. With all the disruptions to global trade and sea freight, air freight, we have seen how global it was and the challenges that this entailed. Just to give, so we buy more than 10% of the coffee production, green coffee production in the world. We buy more than 10% of the cocoa. We are a big dairy buyer. But, you know, you could look at all the commodities, agricultural commodities, and we are, of course, very, very active. And those are truly global supply chains. And many of those commodities actually are coming from emerging markets, including Africa, LATAM, and Asia. We work directly with 500,000 farmers, but we know that we got a lot more. We got millions indirectly in our supply chain. We got dozens of thousands of suppliers across the world and dozens of thousands of customers. So there are indeed huge challenges entailed to that global footprint, and you know, those challenges are very similar to the challenges that the world is facing, and that's why we are so committed and so engaged across the SDG agenda. Maybe let me highlight a few areas where we see a big involvement from the Nestle side, and then I'll come back to the second part of your question. How do we make sure that this is embraced by the organization top to bottom? I would like to, of course, there is the issue of human rights, and you know, when it comes to having them respected across our supply chain, we know that this goes way beyond having a supplier code, and that requires intervention on the ground and very, very clear policies. So we are, of course, committed to that. Nazarene mentioned, and it's been mentioned a few times, the topic of education. Education is a pillar of social and economic development, and this is theoretically accessible to everyone, every country, can develop its human capital. We believe that we can play a role and the business can play a role. And we do it through many different initiatives. One is this Global Youth Initiative, which we got, where we active across countries to provide economic opportunities to the youth. Youth is the most fragile part of society. They have been the most exposed and the most impacted by the last crisis, but also the previous ones. And we believe that we can do and play a role when it comes to education for employment, and business actually can play a role through traineeships, apprenticeship schemes, but also through direct employment. We are also very active when it comes to nutrition education. It's unfortunately a topic which is little taught across the education system, and you can teach and you can learn how to live a healthy lifestyle, and you can teach and you can learn how to have a healthy diet. And we got the knowledge, we got the willingness also to contribute and raise healthier generations. So we got this Nestlé for Healthy Kids program, which we promote and communicate and just teach across the world with the education system. Farmers, good farming practices, sustainable farming, economy, marketing, those are also topics that are very relevant for farmers, and especially the young farmers, and education, of course, there plays a key role. I just would like also to highlight that when it comes to the rule of law, this is one of those very, very important. So peace and institution, very important topic, not so much in the limelight, unfortunately. And it's also a pillar of economic and social development. I think business can play a role there. And we got a number of activities in Latin America in particular, being active in post-conflict areas, for instance. We don't walk away when there is a conflict, but we try to work with the community to provide opportunities and to be there and help restore sustainable institutions. And we believe also that when it comes to corruption and anti-corruption, which is unfortunately, and we talk also about informality prevailing in large parts of the world, not to say across the world, business can play a role as well, especially, and this is what we have been doing in many countries in Latin America, teaching and educating SMEs in how to fight corruption, which is not easy, of course. It's a lot more difficult for smaller companies. So I think there the business can play a role. Just a few examples of things that we are doing. So how do we ensure that the company of our global dimension is aligned top to bottom to make those commitments and this global agenda, SDG agenda, a reality embraced by the entire organization? I think the first, of course, the very, very first point is to make sure that you got a very strong set of values and principles. But it's great to have a very strong set of values and principles. It's another thing to make sure that this is embraced and this is a living reality across the organization. So, of course, those values of respect for people, diversity, cultures, natural resources, fairness, openness, transparency have to be lived and embraced across the organization. And the critical point is to make sure that there is no space for ambiguity and that there is no double standard. What is the reality in the US should be the same in Bolivia or in Peru, the way we live those values and principles. And then the critical point is whenever we take commitments, global commitments, and we got a number of global commitments when it comes to the sustainable development goals, education, I mentioned it, or climate, for instance, and we got that commitment now and that target to be to achieve zero net emission by 2050. The only way to get there, or this commitment that we got also to provide 10 million economic opportunities to the youth by 2030, the only way to make sure that you get there is not only to have a global commitment, but then to make that global commitment a commitment for every part of the organization. So we got a commitment, we are divided in 3 regions. The 3 regions have targets. Those targets are cascaded down to the local operations, and everyone has got a piece of the target and has to work in a aligned way to make those commitments a reality. That's the way we make sure that we basically operationalize those ambitions, those global targets, so they don't stay at the global level, but they are cascaded down to every part of the organization, and every part of the organization is engaged and is part of the solution. So that's the way we work, and that's the way we have been capable to achieve a number of important global goals, and that's the way we will achieve those net zero emission by 2050, I'm convinced.
Thank you. And thank you also so much for your commitment, particularly for youth employment. You are the chair of the GAN, the Global Apprenticeship Network, and you really put a lot of your personal effort, your personal ambitions into the GAN. So thank you so much also for this. We are running out of time, but please stay with us because we still have Kate, and Kate give us a very good overview what Plan International is doing when it comes to women and children who have been particularly hit by Corona, and how Plan is engaging and partnering with the private sector on that. Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthias, and I will keep my remarks brief as I know we're almost at time. So really pleased to be here and to speak a bit about what Plan is doing. Plan is a girls' rights organization with an aim to create a more equal world by transforming the lives of 100 million girls around the world so that they're safe, educated, and economically empowered. We typically serve girls and young women ages 14 to 30 in over 70 countries around the globe. COVID has had a tremendous impact on all aspects of these young women's lives. In a recently released report titled Weathering the Storm, we learned that upwards of 743 million girls are currently out of school due to the pandemic, and it's estimated that millions will likely never return. In addition, education, mental health, and livelihoods were identified as the key concerns to these girls over the past year. That's pulled from in-depth surveys with girls in over 14 countries. 95% of these girls in the study said that the pandemic has negatively impacted their lives, and 88% are experiencing heightened levels of anxiety. And when asked how the pandemic affects their future, girls are most concerned about their employment opportunities, future income, and the ability to continue their education. So we know that the virus itself doesn't discriminate, but it is exacerbating these pre-existing inequalities with adolescent girls. And this has led to more girls not returning to school and a rise in child labor for the first time in 2 decades. Specifically, in terms of our engagement with the private sector, we work across various technical areas, including education with the provision of technology and helping to pivot curriculum and teaching to accessible online and offline platforms. In the health space, with partnerships with various feminine hygiene companies to provide comprehensive and context-specific menstrual hygiene management information and commodities, and of course, in emergency situations to assist with the provision of life-saving materials. I'm going to give a quick example of how we work currently in the economic empowerment space under a mechanism that brings together institutional funding as well as private sector funding. There is a mechanism called a GDA, or a Global Development Alliance, that is issued by the U.S. Agency for International Development. We are working with USAID and 2 private sector apparel companies within the industrial parks in Ethiopia to support young Ethiopian women as they enter into formal employment in the industrial parks. This is often their first time entering into formal waged employment. The goal of the program is to increase their financial resiliency, as well as support the host communities to benefit financially and socially from their increasing population, and to support the private sector to increase the retention of their workforce and start to see the return on their investment in these new geographies. Specifically, working with the private sector and institutional donors together, we're able to better serve the needs of the new female workforce to ensure that they're entering into decent and equitable employment. We're also helping to drive down the attrition rates within the industrial parks, which are currently hovering at around 85% within the first 3 months. And we're partnering with the host communities who are currently dealing with massive influxes in their population, which has led to increases in the price of basic commodities, a lack of housing, and increased instances of gender-based violence and crime. So the project is working to bring the communities, the female workers, and the industrial parks together to identify the challenges and opportunities and co-design solutions. It's important with this project that our work with the private sector includes not just those pieces that are related to the work in the industrial parks, but also their engagement in the surrounding communities or the host communities, so that they are seen as an equal stakeholder, and that we're increasing communication and transparency between the recently arrived workers, the host communities, and the private sector, as there often is a lot of misunderstanding around what's expected, who's going to provide what are the roles and responsibilities. So that is a main focus of this project, is to increase communication, collaboration, and transparency in that whole process and start to bring the private sector more into the heart of all development activities that we're doing. So perhaps I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Matthias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. That was really fascinating about this very concrete project on the ground between the private sector and Plan International. We are running out of time. Thank you so much to the panel. It was really, I think, very insightful. Over to you, Roberto.
Well, thank you to all the participants. Thank you to our partners, the government of Qatar, also the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, Andrea. Thank you to all those who have already helped us also to have this event behind, working on the back, Shay, and also Angela, and all the IOE team, including also Matthias. I think that's for us not just a dialogue, it's also a way to identify how we have to focus. I think many of you have really insisted on the need to have the trust that is needed to have efficiency, to be on the ground, to be realistic. And I think that's the point that Renat has very much insisted, and I cannot agree more on that. We also need to be focused on those areas where the private sector contribution can make a huge difference. And Laurent also referred to the skills area, the educational also element in which we can really bring a big innovative approach, creativeness approach, which is missing very often. And the way forward also has to do with the commitment of IOE and its membership, and with the resident coordinators. And this is the agenda that we have already. We have a kind of set of dialogue that will be following. The next one will be in Asia, but beyond that, and also in Africa. But beyond that, what we want is also to work in areas which have added value in terms of the employers' organization input and the business input in policy change, and informality, education. Also, the gender agenda is going to be one of the first push that we are going to provide. And also on the good understanding that we need also the support of governments for having a proper business environment in order precisely to provide the jobs, to provide the decent jobs that we are all looking for. So that would be the way forward in the very short and middle term. And we want again to thank all those who have participated in this event, also to helping us for moving this agenda. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you very much also for joining us. We'll keep in touch.